Hello. Now we're here to talk about ancillary processes. So this was just kind of my catch-all for things that didn't quite fit into previous lectures or previous lessons. So we'll see some different things here. First and foremost, pasteurization. So pasteurization. Why would this be important? The possibility that something live could make it into your final packaging is a real possibility. No matter how careful you are, there's always a possibility that some kind of microbe has made it into your finished product. And that may be from the yeast that you pitched, and maybe there was a higher than normal bacterial load that you weren't expecting, or that you didn't notice if you were washing your yeast. Or it could also just be when you were packaging on your packaging line. Let's say you're doing an atmospheric fill on your cans. You left the door open, a wind blew in, some random bacteria microbe that happened to get in there. Unlikely, but possible. So the idea of pasteurization, and it's just like with food products, milk, anything like that, is you heat up the product to kill any microbe, any life that is in there. That can help prevent any spoilage bacteria. That will also kill any of your brewer's yeast that made it in there. May or may not be a good thing, depending on what style you're packaging. So, like I said, it uses heat to inactivate the yeast and any potential spoilage microorganisms in the final packaging. And it can be done either before packaging. If you do it before packaging, you run the risk of introducing those microbes in your packaging processes. Or it can be done after packaging. And the issue there is you have to heat your package up. It may not necessarily be an easy thing, a bad thing, or a great thing. The issue with using heat to kill any of the microbes that may or may not be present or you may or may not have introduced is it accelerates any oxidation processes or reactions that may have already started. So you're as careful as you possibly can, but inevitably there's some oxygen introduced, picked up along the way. And that is a chemical reaction that takes X amount of time to occur. When you add heat to a chemical reaction, that speeds up the process. It shortens the overall time it takes for that reaction to occur. So when you add heat to a potential oxidation reaction, that is going to speed up that oxidation reaction. That is going to potentially, if you had oxygen in that product, it's going to potentially cause those oxidation off flavors, which is kind of the opposite of really what we're looking for. We're looking for shelf stability here. So the idea is that you are killing off any potential spoilage bacteria or yeast in the idea of lengthening your shelf life. On the flip side of that is if your processes weren't good and you did pick up more oxygen than what you expected, that is going to shorten the life of that beer because it is going to increase the speed at which that oxidation reaction is going to occur. And like I said, it does make a product shelf stable if package fermentation is possible from the yeast or bacteria. So the process of this is holding that liquid, that package, that whatever you've got there, between 162 and 180 for a short period of time. It is a temperature and time dependent process. The lower the temperature, the longer the time. The higher the temperature, the shorter the time. So what you need to find is that nice balance between heat and the time at which you need to keep that liquid at that heat in order to kill any of the microbes that you're wanting to kill. That is a balance that whatever your equipment, it may be dependent upon the equipment that you have, whether or not you can reach a certain temperature and hold it for a certain amount of time. So, heat pasteurization, there are a couple of different options. So tunnel pasteurization, this would be a post-packaging pasteurization process. So you've got your bottle or your can and it's running down the line. Before it gets to, let's say your 6-pack, your 12-pack, your case packaging, it is going to pass through this tunnel pasteurization process. So what it basically is, it's a tunnel. It goes through, it's going to raise the temperature of that package up to your desired temperature and for the desired amount of time before it begins to start to cool down. And it'll exit that tunnel, hopefully at the cooled down temperature, and enter into your packaging process at that point. Bath pasteurization would be taking a small batch of your finished product, dumping it into a hot water bath, and based on the calculated time that is needed, leave it in that hot water bath for a certain amount of time and then pull it out to let it cool down from there. Flash pasteurization would be an example of a pre-packaging pasteurization process. So this is where the beer is going to be passed through a heat exchanger system, similar to what we do when we cool the wort down post-boil, except the opposite. We're going to heat it up to at least the 163 to 185, whatever the number was I just quoted a second ago. We're going to heat it up to that pasteurization temperature using that counterflow heat exchanger, or whatever heat exchanger you happen to have for this process. And then back it back down to packaging temperatures, flash cool it back down to the correct temperature, and then put it into the product. And I'm sure if you're thinking like I am, you're taking finished carbonated product and running it through a heat pasteurization, you're talking about significant temperature and significant pressure to maintain that carbonation. Or you're going to have to flash carbonate post-pasteurization, and then also you potentially introducing more contamination if your gas isn't sterile. It's a process. It's a process. And then we've got chemical stabilization, chemical pasteurization. Most common form is going to be a sulfite, sulfur dioxide, potassium metabisulfite, sodium bisulfite, K-meta, sodium metabisulfite. Most common form of chemical stabilization of a product, commonly used in wines. You'll see wines labeled all the time, contains sulfites. What they do is they inhibit the growth of microorganisms through a chemical means. If your concentration is 10 parts per million or above, your label must have a warning stating contains sulfites, and that is according to the TTB. So any product that we were to use a chemical stabilizer in, most likely you're going to be at or above that 10 part per million addition, and then you got to label it as such, which people may not even notice, people may not care. Some people do care because it kind of gets a general negative stereotype from people in the wine industry, which it really shouldn't. It's used very commonly, and it doesn't really cause any issues. Some people are sensitive to sulfites. Whether or not that's something else in there, I don't know, but it needs to be labeled if you're using it. Filtration. So filtering removes a significant portion of the remaining yeast or any other solids that may be in suspension. The issue with that is if you have a certain micron size filter, it is going to stop everything, whether or not that be a positive or negative thing. So yeah, you're going to filter your yeast out, you're going to filter possibly any bacteria, although the filters are going to be probably larger than the bacteria itself. But it's not just going to affect the yeast, it's always also going to affect potentially some flavor active compounds, and it could affect the flavor of your beer in a negative way. The other way that it can affect your beer in a negative way is the filter media itself. You have to sterilize it, you have to flush it out flush the oxygen out of the filter process, and whatever happens to be left behind, the beer is going to be in contact with. So it is going to come in contact with your sanitization process. It is going to come in contact, if your filter is a paper media, sometimes that paper media can transfer some of its flavor qualities. Now, filter, I've never filtered. I've really not had any issues that we would need to solve with filtration. But it is a very quick way to produce a very bright beer in a very short amount of time. If you're looking at cycling your tanks very quickly, you don't have the time to let things settle out as quickly as they might, or as long as they might need to sit. Filtration is the way to really get that out of there. There are a few filter methods. So you got plate and frame is a very common form, very cost-effective form. The problem is the filter media itself, usually some kind of paper filter. Not the most reusable, and also it can be difficult to sterilize or sanitize before and after use. DE filter, or diatomaceous earth, very small fossilized microalgae, very effective filter media. Comes with its own risks and hazards, but very common. And then you've got a cartridge filter, which would be similar to like a whole house filter. It is a filter media housed inside of a cartridge. And I think something I did not mention here would be a centrifuge. And that is a very, very expensive piece of equipment that spins the beer very fast and spins through centripetal force, forces those solids out of suspension very quickly. And to the point where I think some, you kind of have to dial it in. If you get your beer too bright, you can affect flavor. And like if you got a Hefeweizen, you don't want to centrifuge it as much as a Pilsner, say. But a lot of people do choose to centrifuge their yeasty beers, hazy beers, things like that. But it is an effective method of removing particulate material from beer, if you can afford it. This is an example of a plate and frame filter. What you got there is you got a bunch of plates and you got a bunch of frames squeezed together. The beer is passed through there and it filters all your solids out. I have heard some horror stories about the filters getting clogged. Basically, you have to tear it down, spray it out, re-sanitize, and start the process all over again. If you're pulling very particulate beer from your tank, it can be a real issue. All right, and this is a DE filter, diatomaceous earth, a very interesting contraption that contains these little guys. That is what I said, fossilized microalgae. And is really just the calcified exoskeletons of the algae causing or forming a very effective filter bed, basically. You can see there that it's probably one of the best filtration beds available. So then we get to analyzing products. So another one of the processes that we go through after packaging, and sometimes before packaging as well, is testing your product. A very common thing to test when you're packaging is dissolved oxygen levels. The main thing that causes, really, the only thing that causes staling reactions in beer is oxidation reactions. That is from oxygen introduced in the process, and not necessarily from the oxygen that you add to the beer, to the wort before fermentation. That's generally going to be all consumed by the yeast during fermentation, during the lag time phase. What we're talking about is oxygen that is introduced either during keg packaging if your hoses were not purged sufficiently, or during transfer from fermentation tank to bright tank if your hoses and your bright tank weren't purged properly. It's very easy to pick up enough oxygen to oxidize an entire batch. So, what do? You purge, you purge, you purge. Everything that is going to touch beer post-fermentation needs to be purged out of all the oxygen as well as you possibly can. And then, if you can afford to, you get yourself a DO meter and you check your DO in your fermentation tank, and then check your DO after transfer to your bright tank to see what your pickup is, and adjust your processes to help reduce that pickup. And also, when you're testing, or when you're going from bright tank to your package, either a keg or glass bottle or aluminum can bottle, you test again to see what your pickup is from bright to package. And the levels, as we can see here, so wort, we can see we're talking about levels in the parts per million. So that is what we want to see. That is dissolved oxygen that's beneficial for yeast health. It allows them to reproduce, it allows them to make their phospholipid bilayer for cell wall to multiply. Once that's done with fermentation, we want it to be less than 10 parts per billion. Notice the difference there. In wort, we want it to be parts per million. In beer, we want it to be parts per billion. That's 1,000-fold difference. 1,000 times less oxygen that needs to be in that liquid. So post-fermentation, we want it to be less than 10 parts per billion. And generally that's not going to be an issue unless you have a tank with a huge amount of headspace that the fermentation process is just not able to purge. Whatever your headspace is, if it's a reasonable amount of normal headspace, fermentation, CO2 generation during fermentation is going to push any remaining oxygen that is in that tank well out of there. You're not going to have any issue. Unless your headspace is huge and it is just going to continually mix. So if you've got a tank that is for 10 barrels and you're putting 2 barrels in it, that's not a good idea. So for filtration, this is a number that we would like to see, and that's one of the issues that you see with the plate and frame filter is trying to purge all the oxygen out of that filter media. We're looking at a pickup of 5 to 50 parts per billion. Bright beer after filtration, it needs to be between 10 and 50 parts per billion. Beer at the filler head, whether that be for a can, bottle, or keg, should be 10 to 30 parts per billion. And then once you're in your package, a bottle, 20 to 50, a can, 30 to 60 parts per billion. And then the total package oxygen, which includes dissolved oxygen and the oxygen in the atmosphere above the beer, is 40 to 150 parts per billion. And obviously, the finished package concentration and the TPO, you want that to be as low as possible. The lower your numbers, the better off you are as far as a length of time of shelf stability for your product, and the life of your product. The higher that number, the quicker that oxidation reaction is going to occur, and a greater extent or a larger production of that trans 2-nonenal product that contributes that paper or wet cardboard flavor, that staling flavor. So when we have a canning or bottling line, when is the time to measure DO? As soon as it's capped, as soon as it's seamed, you want to measure. Now, that being said, the cheapest DO meter that I've been able to price out is about $11,000. For most small breweries, that's just not feasible, not economically feasible. For a larger brewery, putting out a whole lot of beer in a year, it's well worth that price. To guarantee that your product is going to be able to last what you're going to quote your retailers or your distributors, it's well worth the investment for a large packaging brewery. A small brew pub, no. So, a different kind of filling, some barrel filling. So this is packaging that's a little different. It's kind of an intermediary packaging process. So barrel aging is the in thing. It's hype. It's great. Customer wants it. Customer will pay a premium for it. It's kind of a win-win, and then it is a very good way to partner with distillery if it's nearby you. I highly recommend striking up a relationship with a distillery because chances are they won't even make you pay for them as long as it is a beneficial thing that both can advertise. A cross-marketing opportunity is huge. So, very different than regular packaging, but in the same respect, it's very same. You're filling a package. What are you going to do? You're going to purge it. Okay? Then you're going to fill slowly at first. Once you're covered up, you can fill a little quicker. Like I said, it's an intermediate step to packaging. Purge. Purge, purge. If nothing more than just to enjoy the smell of that barrel. How long after dumping? So you get a barrel. The most ideal situation is the distillery would have dumped that barrel that day. You pick it up, you bring it back to your brewery, and you fill it that day. That is the most ideal situation. Anything beyond that, that barrel is slowly drying out and slowly shrinking and slowly becoming non-watertight. If the liquid inside can get out, bacteria can get in. So the longest I've been able to successfully fill a barrel after it has been dumped was approximately 3.5 weeks, and we did have a few leaks here and there. I had one where the person had given it to me, and it was probably 1.5, 2 months after dumping. I could not get it to become watertight again. And spraying the outside, filling it up a quarter full with beer, and just I couldn't get it to swell back up to seal up again. So you want to try to make sure that you limit your time between spirit dumping and beer filling. And then, how long do you age it? You might have a number in mind already. Let's say, like, we're going to put this in there. We're going to let it age for a year. Period. Doesn't matter. I don't care. Put it in there. Forget about it. On the flip side of that is, if you are wanting to try to introduce the beer as quickly as possible, the only thing you're going to do is taste testing. When you feel like the aging process has brought you that balance of beer and spirit that was remaining in that barrel, you want that particular effect, that particular strength of that spirit in your beer, then it's time to pull it. You know, the amount of time is irrelevant if you're looking for a flavor profile. That being said, the customer likes to hear the amount of time that it was aged in a barrel, and they associate significant aging with a higher price tag. And as they should. You spend more time sitting on a beer, that's less time that you could be cycling that barrel, putting more beer through it. So removing from your barrel. So the barrel is wood. Wood does not handle pressure very well. I would recommend that you not put more than 2 psi of pressure on a wooden barrel. And honestly, that's about all you need to get that liquid out and into your tank. It doesn't have to be a whole lot. It's not a race, especially when you're dealing with a very fragile, non-pressure bearing container. The other option is to pump it out. The issue with that is if you don't effectively purge your pump, I mean, you're just mixing whatever air is in that pump with that beer. And if it has any oxygen in there, you're oxygenating your batch and just ruining your batch. If you have a process so you can guarantee that there is 0 oxygen mixing in that pump, then it's probably not that big of a deal to use a pump to get that out of that barrel and into your tank. That being said, unless you're lifting that beer out of that barrel into a very tall tank, 1 to 2 psi is probably going to be sufficient to move that beer from that barrel and into your tank. Anything higher than that, and honestly, you're gonna risk blowing the top off your barrel, or blowing, if your barrel is a vertically aged barrel, blowing the top off. If your barrel is a horizontally aged barrel, you're going to blow out the sides. That's not what you want to do. You can see an example here of a vertically aged barrel being filled with a barrel filling device. Very simple in idea. You've got a device that goes all the way to the bottom of your barrel. You're filling it up. It's slow at first, a little faster once you cover up your device, and you can make sure that you're not generating a whole lot of surface agitation for your beer to mix with the atmosphere. And that's all it is. You fill it up until you get liquid right at the top, move on to the next one. And then make sure you can move it to where you're going to age it. All right, thank you.